Hello, welcome to Straightforward, Levant TV's Middle East discussion show, looking at events that unfold in the ever-changing political scene in the region. This week, Turkish voters reasserted their commitment to democracy in Sunday's parliamentary elections. More than 86% of them cast ballots, a level of participation far above the 57% turnout posted by Americans in 2012. The Turks made clear they would not allow President Recep Tayipp Erdogan, an increasingly authoritarian leader, in many opinions and many journalist opinions anyway, to amass even more power, denying him a parliamentary majority while voting in significant numbers for a party representing the Kurdish minority. Let me first welcome my guests here today at the studio, Dr. Yanro Yilmaz Keres and Dr. Simon Waldman of King's College. Thank you very much for being on the show. And before we take a closer look at this remarkable change in Turkey, let's have a look at this brief report.
Turkish President Recep Tayipp Erdogan's hopes of assuming greater powers suffered a major setback on Sunday when the ruling AK party he founded failed to win an outright majority in a parliamentary election for the first time. Erdogan, Turkey's most popular modern leader but also its most divisive, had hoped a crushing victory for the AKP would allow it to change the constitution and create a more powerful US-style presidency. To do that, it would have needed to win 2/3 of the seats in parliament. Instead, it has been left unable to govern alone for the first time since it came to power almost 13 years ago. It faces potentially weeks of difficult coalition negotiations with reluctant opposition parties as it tries to form a stable government and the possibility of another early election. The secularist Republican People's Party remained the second biggest group in parliament, with around a quarter of the vote, but it is ideologically opposed to the AKP and has ruled out any prospect of a coalition with the ruling party. But for jubilant Kurds who flooded the streets of the southern eastern city of Diyarbakir, setting off fireworks and waving flags, there was plenty to celebrate. The pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party crossed a 10% threshold to enter parliament for the first time. With initial results putting it on around 13%, the People's Democratic Party co-leader Selahattin Demirtas ruled out a coalition with the AKP and said the election outcome had put an end to talk of the stronger presidential powers championed by Erdogan.
Dr. Keres, Turkish Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoglu says history has shown that coalition governments were not suitable for Turkey. How would you assess his rather bold statement, especially now?
I think it was a rhetoric that used by the AKP government to get the majority from Turkish people or Turkish Kurdish people, but people of Turkey have made decisions and they decided to have a coalition. And coalition, of course, work. I mean, there has been several different coalition, Demirel and İnönü coalition, Ecevit Erbakan coalition in the past. They have successful government times. And also, if we look at the Grand Coalition in Germany is working very well. There is no reason to not have a coalition. Of course, this is the one problem for AKP. Until now, AKP worked alone and as a one-man party, and the party of Erdogan. And this AKP has no experience of working with other groups, with other political parties. And if they can prevent Erdogan to interfere in the daily politics and stay as a state president of the state, of course, coalition could work very well. And in particular now, Turkey needs a coalition because institutions, all the institutions became AKP institution, not anymore state institution, not anymore independent institution. We need a partner, we need a coalition, whether with AKP and CHP or with pro-Kurdish party, HDP and Nationalist Party and Republican Party to establish a coalition to clean up the mess.
Why was he negative on this occasion?
Of course, they used this discourse before the election. After election, as you can follow today and yesterday, Davutoglu's statement and also today Erdogan's statements, they changed their discourse quickly and saying we need this coalition and we have to talk about this.
Especially the president, of course.
Yes.
Dr. Waldman, in what ways could Mr. Davutoglu could be seen as being undemocratic on this occasion with this particular statement, where he sort of rejects the idea of a coalition?
Well, in this statement, it's important to remember that no political party goes into elections wanting to have a coalition. That's always their worst case scenario. But now that there is a coalition scenario, in order for any government to be formed, of course, he will be more accommodating in the weeks ahead, because it's not going to happen overnight. These are going to be tough negotiations which happen between the ruling AKP party and the different possible coalition partners. It's going to be very, very tough. Make absolutely no mistake about it. And I think that when it comes to perhaps I'm preempting a question that you may have later, what political party the AKP may go into coalition with. I think that the chances are it will be the MHP, the ultra-nationalist MHP. This is the National Movement Party, for various reasons that we could explain. But even that, they're not natural bedfellows when it comes to a coalition. There's going to be some heavy negotiation taking place.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Keller, speaking of a coalition government, tell us more about the issues that any such coalition could face, or maybe not, when it comes to a coalition between the AKP and the CHP, or the CHP and the HDP and the MHP even altogether.
Firstly, this is the main problem, is the corruption. Mm-hmm. Any coalition with AKP or without AKP, they have to focus on the corruption. And there are people within the former government involved in allegedly in corruption. They should be sent to the Supreme Criminal Court. And this is the one first. Second issue is, of course, every parties have their own programs. For example, CHP has social programs. They will try to implement this, and the HDP has a program to solving the Kurdish problem in Turkey. They will talk about all these issues, but also about the freedom of expression, about the freedom of media, and how to eliminate or reduce the power of AKP government over the institutions. Mm-hmm. As I mentioned, at the moment, institution is not anymore state institutions, it is AKP institutions. Mm-hmm. And therefore, there will be hard, as you say, there will be hard discussion about this. And another issue is, of course, the position of Erdogan. Now, Erdogan went to joined to Davutoglu in the election campaign. Indeed, he lost the election. He lost his legitimacy at the moment as a president of Turkey. And whether he will stay there or not, this is another question, because some parties maybe will reject against his positions, because he's not anymore impartial. The political figures, maybe he will give up his position and come back to the AKP. I'm saying maybe, because at the moment, the people of Turkey rejected him for...
Well, speaking of Turkey, well, Dr. Waldman first.
I mean, lots of things were said there, most of which I agree with. The one thing that I would slightly disagree is the idea that Erdogan has lost his legitimacy, full stop. He hasn't lost his legitimacy as a president within the confines of the constitution. He's lost his legitimacy if he wants to extend the powers of the presidency. The Turkish people have clearly voted against that. But it was just last year that he was voted with over 50% of the population for him to be a president, not necessarily the president that he wants to be. So I think it's important to put that caveat there. And one other thing is, I think the challenge that is facing the new coalition, if one ever gets formed, is not just AKP hegemony over state institutions. Mm-hmm. It is something even more, I would say, something which is almost a client-patron relationship, which the AKP has started to create among not just themselves and their constituents, but also business elites, pro-AKP media, conglomerates, even construction companies. And that has to be dismantled and replaced with a more open, fair, liberal society. And that's a tough challenge down the line.
Mm-hmm. And now we are joined by Orsan Göksel, lecturer at the Department of Political Science and International Relations in Istanbul. 29 Mayıs University, talking to us from Istanbul. Welcome to our discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here.
Dr. Oghsan Göksel, how can we interpret the results of the elections this time?
Well, of course, the results, which is basically a hung parliament with no party having absolute majority, were clearly unexpected in Turkey and abroad, and it came as a strong or great shock for the AKP, the ruling party. After all, the party has been in power for almost 13 years, and it has gotten used to ruling as one-party government. However, based on my impressions in the first days after the election, the two main opposition parties, the secularist Kemalist CHP and the Turkish nationalist MHP, appear to have been at least as shocked as the AKP administration in the immediate aftermath of the elections. Both opposition parties are giving very mixed signals these days, seemingly unable to decide what to do with their nearly gained power to dictate the fate of the next government in the country. And then there's the other front. On the other hand, the HDP, a movement that is often described as pro-Kurdish or radical democratic or simply leftist, they've been celebrating the surprising rise in their votes, almost tripling their support since the last elections in 2011, which they participated as independent candidates, of course. And the party, for the first time in the history of the Kurdish national movement and the leftist Turkish movement allied with them, it has managed to pass the dreaded 10% election threshold. And now this new major party of the parliament has a huge responsibility on its shoulders to represent not only Kurds, but also other marginalized groups of the country, such as the Alawis, Yazidis, non-Muslim groups, and also even sexual minorities, such as the LGBT groups, many of which were members of the party, and some of them were even elected members of parliament after the 7th June elections. Now, of course, many commentators are working on what we should make of the results of the elections. My understanding is that there are clear messages for both the AKP and the rising opposition parties. For the AKP, the people's message, I would say, is that the majority of the people in Turkey clearly do not want a transition to a super-presidential system as Mr. Erdogan has wished. So the first outcome we can drive from the elections is that the multi-party parliamentary system of Turkey has wide public support, certainly much more than Mr. Erdogan probably anticipated. And Mr. Erdogan has clearly lost his bid to gain more power. Now is the time for the AKP to adopt a much more compromising attitude towards opposition parties, and also limit its ties with President Erdogan, because simply the party can no longer form a government without the support of another party, and Erdogan's position has been jeopardized. The constitution in Turkey clearly states that the president must be neutral, but that wasn't what we saw in the election campaign, as Erdogan went to the streets, clearly violated the position of president as a neutral person. For the opposition parties as a whole, the message of the ballot box could be that a considerable portion of the citizenry still support the AKP. Of course, they got almost 40% votes still, and they're the biggest party. And that the election results should not be read as a revolution of some sort, one that will end up in the complete elimination of the AKP from the scene of Turkish politics. This is not clearly not the message we should drive. The AKP still has the largest share of seats in the parliament, and it is also the one that can most easily form a coalition government. Therefore, I would say that the peoples of Turkey have clearly stated their desire for the four major parties to negotiate and compromise in the days to come, rather than endlessly fight and bicker among themselves as they've been doing so for the last decade.
Yes, so, stay with us, Dr. Göksel. Let's see what our guest here, Dr. Keleş of the Center of Turkey Studies here in London, has to say in regards to what you just said.
I definitely agree with you. I mean, the AKP will not be disappeared for a long time, but we have to take into consideration that AKP is a coalition in itself, like Turgut Özal Motherland Party, ANAP, and if we look at the AKP now, we can see that the Kurds are leaving the AKP. And there are also huge debate within AKP between the people who are not allowed to participate or have been 2 times, 3 times in the parliament. Now they are not in the parliament, between old and new members that are conflict. And also, you know, many Muslims, of traditional Muslim people from Milli Görüş, they stated that indeed they are not anymore within the circle of Erdogan. They are excluded from the power, and mostly he's with his small circle in the group. And many of the from Islamic side also people leaving the AKP, from the Kurdish side also. And as we know, the liberals, they have left AKP since 2010. And therefore I think AKP will have a huge conflict over the situation over the position of Erdogan in the party, because already they started to discussion between advisor of Davutoğlu and advisor of Erdogan's. But we will see, of course, will not disappear, but AKP will be smaller in the future.
I think that's a very optimistic assessment in terms of the future of the AKP. I think what's happened and what 40% of the vote reflects is it has gone back to its core constituency, if you like, has voted for it. And yes, it lost the floating voters of around 9–10%. But 40% is an incredibly high number of votes to receive. And, you know, this is with an AKP going into this election where it's in a state of flux, as you said, and you're absolutely right. There were some who had 3 terms, and there's an internal AKP policy not to have anyone for longer than 3 terms. So then new politicians coming along, and then at the same time you have essentially Erdogan campaigning for a new presidency. In other words, he was saying if you vote for the AKP and it gets into government, it won't really be the government because a new system is coming along. And still 40% of Turks voted for this party. And that's a very impressive number to receive. One other thing I would add as well, and that is what's at stake in terms of the coalition. If the coalition does not get formed, and 45 days later there's a new election which has to take place. If that's the case, then the AKP may receive an additional amount of votes because of the stability factored in there. Another thing as well is that if there is another party, whichever it be, whether it's the long shot, the HDP, or whether it's the MHP, come into a coalition, and in 1 year's time, the coalition crumbles, no doubt the AKP will be blaming that party for the reason why the government didn't work, instability, the economy collapsing, if that ever happens, hopefully it doesn't.
Do you agree, Dr. Göksel?
I actually completely agree with that assessment.
Why so?
Among the opposition parties now, opposition parties like the CHP, MHP, HDP, all 3 of them, now there's this ongoing debate about how rational it would be for them to enter into a coalition with a party that, according to them, is in decline, and the economy seems to be performing much lower than the early years of the AKP, when Turkish economy was growing about 8–9% per year. Now it has fallen back to 2–3%. And there's certainly a very, very strong group, you know, within all 3 opposition parties, basically arguing that it probably wouldn't be wise for them to enter into a coalition with the party. And I agree that the AKP would certainly blame its partners to 1–2 years from now if the economy gets even worse. So yes, that may be one of the key reasons why the coalition may not be formed after all.
Yes, Dr. Göksel, what should we make of the sudden rise of the socialist pro-Kurdish rights party HDP and its charismatic leader Demirtas?
Of course, I believe that the HDP is really the only clear winner of these elections, despite being the fourth largest party in the parliament. It's a party that has its ideological roots within the Kurdish national movement, a small fringe group of the 1970s and 1980s, and now it has become a key player of Turkish politics. A surprising victory for even many Kurds, Kurdish intellectuals that were part of the movement for many years. In this regard, the main question is, and I think that will be the issue that many of us will work on in the coming years, how has this success happened? There are two opinions on this. Have the Kurds suddenly become more conscious of their national identity, or is the victory of the HDP the result of something else entirely? I strongly position myself in the second camp in this context. I argue that the rise of the HDP has actually nothing to do with identity politics, unlike how the Western mainstream media attempt to portray it these days. Actually, the HDP's rise began 2 years ago with the Gezi Park protests of 2013, though the party didn't even exist back then, and I'll elaborate. So during the Gezi Park protests 2 years ago, it was the first and largest social uprising against the Turkish state in western parts of the country. The secular middle-class Turks, fringe socialist groups, anti-AKP liberal intellectuals, and Kurds, for the first time in history, began to realize that they have a common enemy in the form of the increasingly authoritarian AKP and Mr. Erdogan. And the Turkish youth, for the first time since the turbulent days of the 1970s, witnessed firsthand police brutality that left 14 citizens dead and hundreds more injured. Debates after that started among Turkish secularists and socialists, a debate that has been going on since then. If the Turkish state forces can be this much brutal, the Turks waving Turkish flags and Atatürk flyers in western cities such as Istanbul, Izmir and Ankara, just imagine how the Kurds who wave Turkish flags must have been repressed for many decades.
Let's see, Dr. Gökçel, what Dr. Kellis has to say about this phenomenon.
I definitely agree with Oğuzhan, but we have to also look at some more deep issues. For example, the political change in the Middle East. The Kurds, after all these silence years, they came back now as a political actors in the Middle East, in South Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan, but also in Syria. In particular, I think Kobani, if we talk about the history of the Kurds, we will talk before Kobani and after Kobani. The Kobani has created such a huge impact, influence amongst all the Kurds, in particular, for example, amongst the Alevi Kurds who were not really near the Kurdish political movement. Now they joined, after Kobani movement, they joined also the Kurdish political movement strongly. And also I think the HDP became hub for the Kurds and the Turks to overcome the nightmare which proposed by Erdogan and Erdogan AKPs. And of course we have to also look at the charismatic leadership of the HDP, in particular Demirtas. He played really, with his campaign, he played very important role. He connected the Turks and Kurds, he connected different subordinated groups, subordinated ethnic religious groups, but also LGBT people and in particular women. If you look at the party, almost 48% of candidates were women.
There's a bit of a novelty in Turkey when it comes to politics. Don't you think this is being mobilized now for not really the aims of those sub-communities, but more for political maneuver?
I mean, within the Kurdish political movement, the women are already mobilized. The mayor of the Diyarbakir, the capital city of the Kurds, is a woman, Gülten Kışınak. And of course, we see now there is some changes also. Many in Turkey, many women, in particular feminists, they were not interested in politics. Now, with the HDP, they started also be a part of this movement. And from the Kurdish side and from Turkish side and from other ethnic minorities, women certainly come into the political sphere and started to talk about their demands. I think this is the new trend, really.
Dr. Göksel, how is Mr. Erdogan's remaining time in office going to be affected by the election results and the resignation of his cabinet?
Yes, I would say the forthcoming period in Turkish politics will witness many political games, maneuvering, outmaneuvering, and secret deals, as it has been going on for the last 3 days. As one commentator puts it, now is the time for Game of Thrones or House of Cards type of political flexibility and games in Turkey, really. So we shall see together who will come out on top. And when we come to the fate of Erdogan, there are two options, really. Either Erdogan will continue to interfere in party politics as he has been done so since his election last summer, continue to violate the principle of the natural neutrality of the presidency as dictated by our constitution, and such a move would negatively affect the transition to a coalition government and the return to democratization. Or there's a second alternative. He will actually dramatically reverse his entire course that he's been following for the last year and act like a constructive, neutral president who's above party politics, having positive impact for a shift towards democratization. It is still very early to say, but my impression from the last 4 days since the elections hint that he has actually taken a great lesson from the election results, and he's trying for the first time since he became president to be the president of all peoples of Turkey and not just the AKP. And I can give two examples. Yesterday, he tried to smooth things over between the AKP and the secular CHP for the first time, also clearly telling the CHP member, Deniz Baykal, a respected leader and former chairman of the party, that if Davutoğlu, the AKP prime minister, if he somehow fails to form a coalition in the few weeks to come, Erdogan will be happy to appoint Kılıçdaroğlu, the CHP leader, as prime minister.
I guess we'll have to wait and see. Dr. Oğuzhan Göksel, lecturer at the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Istanbul 29 Mayıs University, joined us there from there. Many thanks for being on the show. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Waldman, I heard you maybe taking some notes about things that were mentioned. I'm sure you would have to let us know what you think.
I constantly take notes. That's just that's what happens with academic training. Well, when it comes to this election, I'm very reluctant to reduce everything down to Erdogan himself and his particular... this wasn't an election just on Tayyip Erdogan, even though he played a prominent role. So I'm just a bit wary of that, and I think that just should be thrown out there. Something else in terms of the debate about the HDP and why it was successful. I agree with both my academic colleagues with their assertions and the comments that they made. I would like to add just a couple of things in addition to that. I think an important factor for the increase of support for the HDP was just how Demirtas conducted himself in the face of being attacked. Verbally attacked by opposition parties, especially the AKP, and physical attacks, 70 attacks against its offices, institutions, and things of that nature. And the fact that the HDP maintained respect, civility throughout the course of their campaign. In other words, they ran a very good campaign, and I think that should be acknowledged. The other factor as well for their success, and also for the rise of support and seats for the MHP, are those conservatives who are unhappy of the way in which the AKP has conducted itself. In the southeast of Turkey, there was essentially a campaign battle between the HDP and the AK Party. And the HDP won. And it managed to win those people, those Kurds, who formerly voted for the AKP. Conversely, the MHP managed to get these extra conservative votes because of nationalist Turks who were unhappy of attempts of having a peace process with the Kurds as well. So, I mean, it's important to note where those disaffected AKP votes went to, the reasons why, and a smaller percentage of those, it's sad to say, a smaller percentage of those were those who were liberally minded, the spirit of Gezi and that kind of thing, even though an important minority, this is the intellectual liberals of Istanbul, Ankara and other big cities.
Dr. Kellis, as a researcher at Middlesex University, how do you see the future of the peace process between Turkish government and Kurdish actors going?
Firstly, we can see that the Kurds have no any more trust to AKP because they didn't vote, they didn't support this time the AKP. Indeed, the Kurds sent the Turkish parties to home, if you analyze all the outcomes. And secondly, I think Erdogan government has no intention to solve the problem. They use this peace process to convert this, the support of the Kurds to have the majority government. And at the end of the day, now the Kurds lost their trust to Erdogan government or the AKP government. We have to keep in mind this process has started in 2009, and there is the outcome is zero. And the Kurds have they say enough is enough. It doesn't work with this government, and therefore they left the AKP government, including the person who was chairman, who was the responsible, who was the he established the AKP, one of the establisher, Mehmet Dengiroğlu. He left even the AKP, and now he's MP of HDP. Now, what will be if there will be any possible coalition between CHP and AKP? I think CHP has already declared they would like continue with the peace process, and if there will be coalition with a nationalist party and AKP, there will be more difficulties, and even the ceasefire maybe will be break down.
Yeah, I would just like to add to that. I think that's a very strong assessment of the AKP and its policy towards the peace process. In other words, it's a policy of continuing the process, but not actually finalizing what is being exchanged. And there's a certain amount of political risk involved. And that's why, sadly, I think that as long as there's a coalition government, you're not going to see any kind of conclusion of the peace process. Reason being is that, one of the most important factors which Kurdish representatives always put forward consistently about the process is the release of Öcalan. And that's something which is just fraught with political risk. Another factor would be would be investigations into deep state atrocities against the Kurdish people, extrajudicial killings, things of that nature. There will have to be all kinds of conciliation associations and organizations to essentially dig up what happened back in the past, what happened to those thousands of Kurds who went missing and things of that nature. This is just such a it's a political minefield. So to expect any coalition to do that is, I think, far-fetched, sadly.
Over the last several months, excessive use of force by the police has become all too common in Turkey. The most significant example took place on May Day 2013, a historic day of protest in the country. The May 1st gatherings, as well as attempts to celebrate the day in Taksim Square, were met with police violence. President Erdogan's remarks in a recent interview given on June the 2nd this year are indicative of this authoritarian tone. He said, quote, "If they have 20,000 people in Taksim today, I can bring 500,000 to Kizileshme. We have the opportunity, we have the power." The police in Europe reacts even stronger than in here. Dr. Waldman, do you think those events from 2013 are the seeds that were sowed that what brought today what is somehow seen as a fruitful result in Turkey?
To some extent, that is certainly the case. It certainly has had its impact internationally. No longer is Turkey hailed as an example or a model for democratic countries or countries on the process of democracy to follow. There used to be a time when Barack Obama said that one of his closest international colleagues was Tayyip Erdogan. He only only talks to him when he really, really needs to. So yes, it did hurt Turkey internationally in terms of its reputation and in terms of parties like the HDP and its agenda. It did certainly ride on the waves of the Gezi Park emotions and outpouring after that. In terms of protests, I think it's something that's important to note, is that you are free to protest in Turkey. But if you are going to engage in protests which are heavily critical of the AKP or Tayyip Erdogan, it's going to be met with some police brutality. However, if you're going to attend a protest which is supportive of the AKP line, so for example, if you want to protest and say that the Hagia Sophia should be turned into a mosque, you will receive support, perhaps even logistical support and flags to wave at your protest and go home safely. You may even be able to take your kids along as well.
So it's pick and choose. Basically,
it's pick and choose as long as it
selective.
supports the government.
Now we are joined by Fra Hughes, activist and commentator, joining us from Belfast in Northern Ireland. Mr. Hughes, tell us, what are your remarks, whether negative or positive, on the elections in Turkey?
Well, I think it must be seen very much as a way forward for democracy. There's because of the elections and because of the vote for the HDP party, there's definitely a broader coalition and a broader representation of the Turkish electorate within the parliament, and the powers that President Erdogan wanted to further extend for himself as the president have been curtailed by the electorate, which can only be a positive result.
Yes. And how is the Kurdish entry into the cabinet for the first time in Turkey look to you from a minority rights perspective?
Well, they seem to have a very broad platform to try and bring as many people on as possible, to bring as many voters to become attracted to their manifesto and their kind of political party line. So the gay community, ethnic minorities, and obviously the Kurdish question itself now has a true voice within the parliament and has a substantial 80 member bloc within the legislature.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Hughes, since 2011 and the Syrian uprising and eventually a quasi-war on terror, how would you assess President Erdogan's role in influencing the European and even world powers' agendas in Syria during that, especially the earlier stages?
Well, I think President Erdogan is very, very, very keen to have a regime change in Syria. As such, I don't know if he's influencing the West or he's being used by the West. Obviously, it also suits the American imperialist agenda in the Middle East to have Turkey supporting and training ISIS on one side of Syria, Israel in the Golan Heights doing the same on the other side, and parts of Jordan involved in supplying arms to ISIS. So I think very much President Erdogan would like to see the democratically elected president of Syria deposed, and to my mind he is and has been seen to be supplying arms to the terrorists of ISIS on behalf of America, who on one hand are claiming to fight ISIS, and on the other hand, through Saudi Arabia and through Turkey and through Israel, are actually arming, training and supplying the very people they claim to be fighting against.
Fra Hughes, political activist and commentator, joined us from Belfast. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts today.
Thank you.
Dr. Kellis, what do you have to say briefly about this notion of ISIS and President Erdogan's stance in the early stages of the Syrian uprising?
I think Erdogan was part of the Sunni bloc. There is in the Middle East there is a struggle between Sunni and Shia blocs, and Erdogan felt he is the leader of the Sunni bloc, and he will bring a new order, remove Assad. Assad is more Alawites, is more related to Shia, and then establish the Sunni corridors from Turkey to Saudi Arabia and to other countries. And there are strong evidence. Recently, in particular, Cumhuriyet newspaper has published images that Turkish government supplies weapons to jihadists. I mean, Turkey was heavily involved, is still heavily involved in Syrian conflict. And if Turkey used to, every time the arguments about the refugees, we have 2 million refugees, but Turkish government responsible for 250,000 killing of the Syrian people. And they destabilize the regions. Assad is a dictator, definitely, it should go, but it could be in a different democratical transition. But Erdogan prevented this. Erdogan gave arms, supplied arms to these jihadists, and at the end of days, we have this mess.
As per the Telegraph newspaper here in England, one of the main reasons for the high turnout was to block President Recep Tayipp Erdogan from rewriting the constitution to enable the country to become a presidential republic. Had Mr. Erdogan's Justice and Development Party, the AKP, won the two-thirds majority it sought, many feared he would return the country to the type of authoritarian rule it experienced when the military was in power. Yet the same article is titled "Turkey shows again that democracy can function in Muslim countries." Dr. Waldman, could it pass really that Mr. Erdogan uses the democratic procedures established in the country and the process, and in an attempt, and his main motive basically is to bring the country back to authoritarianism? So there's a bit of a contradiction there. Is it valid to use democracy to become undemocratic?
Well, the answer to your question is an absolute no. It is not valid to do such a thing and still claim a democracy. In order to understand the AKP and Erdogan and the way in which they conceive democracy is going back to one of Erdogan's earlier statements along the lines of, and I'm paraphrasing, democracy is like a bus ride. You get to your stop and then you get off once you've arrived to your destination. What is the AKP's destination? What is Erdogan's intended destination? Well, essentially what the AKP care about, more importantly than democracy, is to be able to define the nature of Turkish identity, what it is to be a Turk, where is Turkey's place in the world. And associated with this is an underdog mentality. To some extent, it's valid. The idea that the Kemalist or the secularist elite joined with the military have always marginalized the rural and urban poor in Turkey. And it has done so not just through military coups, but also by dominating the different institutions of state. The education system, you name it. And what Erdogan essentially has been trying to do, followed with the AKP and with the support of at least 40% of the electorate, is to reverse this, which means undoing the nature of state institutions in Turkey, to change the people who are part of it. And the last thing was to change the actual constitution and the system itself, and using democratic means in order to gain that outcome. So that's essentially what the AKP has sought to do.
Dr. Kellis, what are your thoughts in terms of policy guidance for Turkey as an associate at CEFTUS, the Center for Turkey Studies, and a researcher at the University of Middlesex? What would you advise for the way ahead in Turkey, especially now when it's really unsure?
I think Turkey have to quickly try to improve the relation with European Union. This is important because the destination of Turkey is Europe. Is not Shanghai, is not any Sunni blocks. Didn't work until now, has created mess. And Turkey is in a geography. If Turkey will be a part of this, if not a part of the European Union, Turkey could be in future as Syria, Iraq, and therefore Turkey government should move quickly. And of course they have to introduce new constitutions. The old constitution doesn't work anymore for society. It's preventing for the democratical development in Turkey, economical development in Turkey. And they promised when they came to power, but they didn't keep their promise. The new coalition government should quickly introduce the new constitution, which include all the peoples in terms of the citizenship, should remove all Turkish nationalistic centered ideologies and including all the people, or all the religious, ethnic, and people with different sexual background, and should legalize and not delegalize these people in the public.
Even though that might clash obviously with the main religion in the country. It might be.
This is. I mean, we say in religion, but Turkey has a huge history in terms of the secular movement, and we have also, as we can see, with the HDP movement, very secular, but also opening the way. We need a democratic secularism, not the Kemalist secularism. Democratic secularism. The separation of power should be there. If not, the institution will become the institution of a party or a man.
President Recep Tayipp Erdogan has long benefited from a weak political opposition, but with the HDP not only providing an outlet for secularists, women and other unhappy groups with Mr. Erdogan, but also enabled the Kurds, an ethnic minority that waged a bloody insurgency against the state for 30 years, to take an important new role as political power brokers. The weeks ahead are likely to be unstable and uncertain. A new election may be necessary if a coalition government cannot be formed, and even if that is attained, formidable challenges persist. A stalled economy, 2 million Syrian refugees living in camps within Turkey's borders, the Islamic State just over the horizon in Syria and Iraq, and troubled relationships with the Turkish Kurds and the West. As this episode comes to an end, and on this note we'll have to end our discussion today, I would like to thank our viewers and of course our guest speakers, Mr. Frayuz, political commentator and activist, Dr. Oğuzhan Göksel, a lecturer from the University of Istanbul 29 Mayıs, and of course our guest here at the studio, Dr. Simon Waldman, lecturer in Middle East and Mediterranean Studies at King's College, and Dr. Yanrov Keles from the Center of Turkish Studies and a researcher at the University of Middlesex. Thank you very much for being on the show. Thanks again for watching. Stay tuned and bye for now.
To not have a coalition. Of course, this is the one problem for AKP. Until now, AKP worked alone and as a one-man party, and the party of Erdogan. And this AKP has no experience of working with other groups, with other political parties. And if they can prevent Erdogan to interfere in the daily politics and stay as a state president of the state, of course, coalition could work very well. And in particular now, Turkey needs a coalition because institutions, all the institutions became AKP institution, not anymore state institution, not anymore independent institution. We need a partner, we need a coalition, whether with AKP and CHP or with pro-Kurdish party, HDP and Nationalist Party and Republican Party to establish a coalition to clean up the mess.
Why was he negative on this occasion?
Of course, they used this discourse before the election. After election, as you can follow today and yesterday, Davutoğlu's statement and also today Erdogan's statements, they changed their discourse quickly and saying we need this coalition and we have to talk about this.
Especially the president, of course. Yes. Dr. Waldman, in what ways could Mr. Davutoğlu could be seen as being undemocratic on this occasion with this particular statement, where he sort of rejects the idea of a coalition?
Well, in this statement, it's important to remember that no political party goes into elections wanting to have a coalition. That's always their worst case scenario. But now that there is a coalition scenario, in order for any government to be formed, of course, he will be more accommodating in the weeks ahead, because it's not going to happen overnight. These are going to be tough negotiations which happen between the ruling AKP party and the different possible coalition partners. And it's going to be very, very tough. Make absolutely no mistake about it. And I think that when it comes to perhaps I'm preempting a question that you may have later. What political party
The pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party crossed a 10% threshold to enter parliament for the first time, with initial results putting it on around 13%. The People's Democratic Party co-leader Selahattin Demirtas ruled out a coalition with the AKP. and said the election outcome had put an end to talk of the stronger presidential powers championed by Erdogan.
Dr. Kilish, Turkish Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoglu says history has shown that coalition governments were not suitable for Turkey. How would you assess his rather bold statement, especially now?
I think it was a rhetoric that used by the AKP government to get the majority from Turkish people or Turkish Kurdish people, but people of Turkey have made decisions and they decided to have a coalition. And coalition, of course, work. I mean, there has been several different coalition, Demirel and İnönü coalition, Ecevit Erbakan coalition in the past. They have successful government times. And also, if we look at the Grand coalition in Germany is working very well. There is no reason to have
Hello, welcome to Straightforward, Levant TV's Middle East discussion show, looking at events that unfold in the ever-changing political scene in the region. This week, Turkish voters reasserted their commitment to democracy in Sunday's parliamentary elections. More than 86% of them cast ballots, a level of participation far above the 57% turnout posted by Americans in 2012. The Turks made clear they would not allow President Recep Tayipp Erdogan, an increasingly authoritarian leader, in many opinions and many journalists' opinions anyway, to amass even more power, denying him a parliamentary majority while voting in significant numbers for a party representing the Kurdish minority. Let me first welcome my guests here today at the studio, Dr. Yanro Yilmaz Keres and Dr. Simon Waldman of King's College. Thank you very much for being on the show. And before we take a closer look at this remarkable change in Turkey, let's have a look at this brief report.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's hopes of assuming greater powers suffered a major setback on Sunday when the ruling AK party he founded failed to win an outright majority in a parliamentary election for the first time. Erdogan, Turkey's most popular modern leader but also its most divisive, had hoped a crushing victory for the AKP would allow it to change the constitution and create a more powerful US-style presidency. To do that, it would have needed to win 2/3 of the seats in parliament. Instead, it has been left unable to govern alone for the first time since it came to power almost 13 years ago. It faces potentially weeks of difficult coalition negotiations with reluctant opposition parties as it tries to form a stable government and the possibility of another early election. The secularist Republican People's Party remained the second biggest group in parliament, with around a quarter of the vote, but it is ideologically opposed to the AKP and has ruled out any prospect of a coalition with the ruling party. But for jubilant Kurds who flooded the streets of the southern eastern city of Diyarbakir setting off fireworks and waving flags, there was plenty to celebrate.